On the night she closed her boarding house, a young woman asked for room 7. The last thing Mabel Reed took down was the brass number from the door of room 7. It left 2 dark nail holes in the pale rectangle where the wallpaper had been protected from 23 years of coal smoke, summer dust, and people carrying their lives up and down the narrow stairs. Mabel held the little brass 7 in her palm for a moment. Then someone knocked at the front door. 3 slow knocks. Not the hurried rap of a bill collector, not the neighborly tap of Mrs. Doherty from across the alley. Whoever stood outside knocked as though she had traveled a long way and had decided, before raising her hand, that she would not leave without an answer. Mabel looked around the empty room. The iron bed was stripped. The washstand had been sold that morning for $2.75. The oval mirror was gone. Even the faded curtains had been folded into a box downstairs. Tomorrow, a man from First Iowa Trust would come to collect the keys. By Friday, the Reed boarding house would belong to someone else. Another knock came from below. Mabel closed her fingers around the brass number still hidden in her apron pocket. "I'm coming." Her voice sounded strange in the empty house. She descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister polished smooth by thousands of palms. There had been years when every room was full. Railroad men sleeping between runs. Traveling salesmen with sample cases. Teachers from small towns attending summer courses. Widows who said they needed a room for 1 month and stayed 3 years. Girls from farms who came to Des Moines believing a department store counter or telephone exchange would make them independent. Then came 1929. After that, people still arrived, but they carried smaller suitcases, sometimes no suitcase at all. By 1932, Mabel had stopped asking certain questions. Could you pay a week in advance? Did you have steady employment? How long did you intend to stay? A boarding house keeper who insisted on sensible answers during those years could end up with sensible answers and 8 empty bedrooms. Mabel opened the door. A young woman stood on the porch beneath the weak yellow bulb. She was perhaps 26 or 27, tall, thin without looking fragile. Her dark coat was good wool but several seasons old, with the cuffs carefully turned to hide wear. Rain had darkened the shoulders. In one hand she carried a small valise. In the other she held a folded newspaper. "Mrs. Reed?" "Yes." The young woman released a breath. For some reason, that breath unsettled Mabel more than the question. "My name is Helen Avery. I came from Cedar Rapids." Mabel waited. People still appeared occasionally hoping for a room, though the sign had been taken from the porch a week ago. "If you're looking for lodging, I'm afraid you've come at the wrong time. I'm closing." "I know." Helen looked past her into the bare hallway. "I was told tomorrow was your last day." Mabel's hand tightened around the brass number still hidden in her apron pocket. "Who told you?" "A woman at the county hospital. She used to rent here." That could have been half the nurses in Des Moines. Mabel stepped slightly back from the door. "What is it you want?" Helen looked directly at her. "I want to ask you about my mother." There were many sentences Mabel had heard on this porch. "My husband sent me. My husband left me. I lost my job. My train doesn't leave until morning. The room was cheaper in the newspaper. I have a little boy, but he doesn't make much noise. Could you wait until Friday for the rent? Please don't put my things outside." She had heard women whisper that they were pregnant, men admit that they had nowhere else to sleep, mothers lie about money while children stood beside them hungry enough to stare at the sugar bowl. But something about this young woman's voice opened a door in Mabel's memory that she had spent 6 years trying to keep shut. "What's your mother's name?" Helen did not answer immediately. Instead, she unfolded the newspaper. Inside lay a narrow strip of painted metal, no longer than Mabel's little finger. Cream-colored once, now scratched nearly bare. A black number remained visible in the center. 7. Mabel stared at it. Not a room number, a luggage tag. She remembered them. During the worst winter, when people came and went so quickly that suitcases were forever being confused in the hallway, Mabel had found an old box of metal tags at a closing hotel auction. She had painted numbers on them herself and wired them to trunks and bags belonging to long-term boarders. 1 tag for each room. Helen turned the piece of metal over. On the back, scratched by hand, were 3 letters, M-R-H. Mabel did not need to ask who had carved them. She knew. Her legs suddenly felt unsteady. Helen saw it. "You recognize this." Mabel reached for the hall table, forgetting that it had been sold 2 days earlier. Her hand met empty air. "Where did you get it?" "It belonged to my mother." "What was her name?" Helen's expression changed. Until that moment she had seemed cautious. Now she seemed almost afraid. Margaret Avery. Mabel said nothing. Helen continued. Sometimes she called herself Maggie. The house around Mabel disappeared. For a few seconds she was no longer 63 years old, standing in an empty hallway in October of 1938. She was 57. It was February of 1932. There were rolled towels pushed beneath the back door because the cold came through the cracks. 3 men upstairs had not paid rent in 2 weeks. A widow in room 3 was stretching 1 chicken across 4 suppers. The radio had carried another speech the previous evening, but nobody in Mabel's dining room had listened for long. And a woman named Maggie Avery had arrived after midnight carrying a sleeping girl against her shoulder. The girl had been wearing 1 red mitten, only 1. Mabel remembered that more clearly than Maggie's face. 1 red mitten. A child's bare hand against her mother's coat. Mabel looked again at Helen. The porch light caught the left side of the young woman's face. And there it was. Not Maggie's mouth, not Maggie's eyes. Something smaller. A slight hollow beneath the cheek when she clenched her jaw. Mabel had seen Maggie do the same thing whenever someone asked a question she did not intend to answer. "You were the girl," Mabel said. Helen's lips parted. "What?" "The night she came here. She had a girl with her," Mabel swallowed. "About 16 then, perhaps." 16. Mabel closed her eyes. Of course, 6 years. The arithmetic was simple. She wished it were not. When she opened her eyes, Helen was staring at her. "Then you do remember her." Mabel stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The front parlor looked worse with a guest in it. Mabel had never noticed how bare a room could become once the furniture was gone. There remained only 2 straight-back chairs, the small coal stove, and the old radio cabinet nobody had wanted because one tube had been dead since May. Helen sat. Mabel remained standing. "Coffee?" "No, thank you." "You traveled from Cedar Rapids in this weather? You'll have something." "I'm all right." "Nobody who travels 3 hours on a bus in October is all right." The old boarding house habit came out sharper than Mabel intended. Helen almost smiled. Almost. Coffee would be fine. Mabel went to the kitchen. There was little left there either. 3 cups, 2 plates, 1 skillet, a chipped enamel pot, flour, half a loaf of bread, a jar of peaches she had been saving for no particular occasion. She filled the coffee pot and set it on the stove. Her hands were steady. That annoyed her. They ought not to have been steady. Maggie Avery. For 6 years, Mabel had believed she would never hear that name again. She had believed this with the same determined confidence people used when avoiding a cemetery road. Don't look that way, and perhaps the dead will remain where you put them. Helen spoke from the parlor. "My mother died in August." Mabel stopped. The coffee pot hissed faintly. "I'm sorry." She'd been sick since spring. What was wrong? Her lungs. Mabel closed her eyes briefly. Not everything was a punishment. Not everything was connected. She knew that. Still, something cold moved beneath her ribs. Was she in Cedar Rapids? For the last 4 years. And before that? Different places. Mabel brought the cups into the parlor. Helen accepted hers with both hands. Mabel sat opposite her. "What did your mother tell you about this house?" "Almost nothing." That surprised her. Helen turned the cup slowly. "She didn't talk about Des Moines. Whenever I asked about those years, she'd say there wasn't much worth remembering." Mabel looked down at her coffee. "That sounds like Maggie." "You knew her well?" Mabel considered the question. How well did anyone know a boarder? There were things people told the woman who changed their sheets that they would never tell their sisters. There were also things they hid from her until the day they left. "I knew her for about 5 months." Helen stared. 5? Maybe 6. "My mother told me we were here only a few weeks." "You were. She wasn't." Helen's fingers tightened around the cup. "Why?" Mabel did not answer at once. Helen leaned forward. "Mrs. Reed, I didn't come because I wanted stories about where my mother rented a room." "I assumed not." "Then please don't make me drag every answer out of you." Mabel looked up. There was Maggie again. Not in the face this time, in the impatience. Maggie could turn fear into anger faster than any woman Mabel had ever known. Helen reached into her valise. She removed a small brown paper parcel tied with string. "My mother left a box at the hospital." "For you?" "Apparently." "Apparently?" There was no note saying it was mine. A nurse found my name written inside the lid. Helen untied the string. Inside were 4 objects: the luggage tag, a streetcar token, a black comb missing 2 teeth, and a small rectangle of stiff cardboard. Helen handed the cardboard to Mabel. It was an old meal card from the Reed boarding house. Mabel had printed hundreds on the little press at Klein's stationery. Breakfast, supper, 7 days. A circle punched beside each meal after it was served. This particular card had no punches. Across the back, in Mabel's own handwriting, were 4 words: Paid in full, M.R. Mabel stared at them. She remembered writing those words. She remembered exactly where she had been standing. March 3rd, 1932, the kitchen table, snow melting from Maggie's shoes onto the floor, Maggie furious. Mabel even remembered what Maggie had said. She would not take charity. She would sleep at the depot first. She would scrub floors. She would wash every sheet in the house. She would do anything except have another woman feed her child out of pity. So Mabel had written paid in full. It had been a lie. Maggie owed her $12.40. At the time, $12.40 might as well have been $1,200. Why would she keep this? Helen asked. Mabel placed the card on her knee. Your mother kept strange things. Was it really paid? Mabel looked at her. Helen understood before Mabel answered. No. Then why did you write that? Because she needed it to say that. For whom? Mabel hesitated. For herself, mostly. Helen leaned back. Rain tapped against the parlor window. Far away, a train whistle sounded beyond the warehouses. Mabel had heard that whistle from this house nearly every night since 1915. Soon another woman would hear it, or perhaps a dentist if the buyer really meant what he had said about turning the downstairs into offices. Helen looked at the bare walls. My mother was proud. Your mother was terrified. Helen stiffened. Of what? Mabel lifted the coffee cup but did not drink. That depended on the day. Mrs. Reed. There are some things your mother should have told you herself. She can't. The words were quiet. That made them harder. Mabel set the cup down. No. Helen reached into her valise again. This time she removed an envelope. The paper was yellowed. Across the front, in faded ink, was written, Mrs. Mabel Reed, Reed Boarding House, Des Moines, Iowa. There was no stamp, no postmark. It was never mailed, Helen said. Mabel did not touch it. Who wrote it? My mother. You opened it? No. Why not? Because it isn't addressed to me. Mabel looked at the handwriting. 6 years vanished again. Maggie at the kitchen table. Maggie hanging wet stockings near the stove. Maggie cutting Helen's bread into squares because the girl refused to eat crusts. Maggie coming through the back door one evening with blood on the cuff of her coat and insisting it belonged to someone else. Maggie standing at the bottom of the stairs 3 nights later, saying she had made a decision. A bad one. Maybe the only one available. Mabel heard herself ask, when did she write this? I don't know. There was nothing with it. Only the things I showed you. Mabel finally took the envelope. It was heavier than a single sheet of paper. Her name looked wrong in Maggie's handwriting. Too careful. Maggie had never written carefully unless she wanted to control herself. Why did you wait until now? Mabel asked. I didn't. Helen gave a short laugh without humor. I found the box 4 days ago. And came here? I tried to call first. Your telephone has been disconnected. Mabel nodded. She had let it go Monday. Saving 75 cents mattered, even during the final week. The hospital nurse knew someone who knew someone here. That's how I learned you were closing. Helen looked toward the stairs. She said tomorrow was the last day. Today, really. What do you mean? I've already sent everyone away. The bank takes possession tomorrow morning. Helen's eyes moved to the empty room. I thought you owned the house. So did I. Mabel regretted the bitterness as soon as she heard it. She had spent 3 months insisting she was not angry, not at the bank, not at her daughter, not at the years, not at herself. Apparently, all 4 had been waiting just beneath the surface. Helen glanced at the envelope. Please read it. Mabel broke the seal. The first page was covered with Maggie's handwriting. The second was shorter. The third contained only a few lines. Mabel read the first sentence, then the second. At the third, she stopped. The room became very still. Helen watched her. What does it say? Mabel could not answer, because Maggie had not written to thank her. She had not written to apologize. She had written about Helen. And the first thing she had written was something Mabel had spent 6 years trying not to remember. Mabel, if Helen ever comes looking for me, you must not tell her what I did until you know whether she has somewhere safe to go afterward. Mabel lowered the letter. Helen's face had gone pale. What did she do? Outside, another train rolled toward the depot, its iron wheels rattling through the wet October dark. Mabel looked toward the staircase. At the top, room 7 stood empty. She had removed the bed, the washstand, the curtains, the brass number. But suddenly the room did not feel empty at all. It felt occupied by a winter she had never escaped. And Mabel understood that the bank could take the house tomorrow. It could take every door, every floorboard, every room. But before she surrendered the keys, she was going to have to open room 7 one last time. Mabel folded the letter once, along the crease Maggie had already made, and set it on her lap. "Before I read the rest," she said, "I need to tell you what happened here, not what your mother wrote afterward, what I saw." Helen drew her coat closer around herself, although the coal stove was warm. "All right." Mabel looked toward the dark staircase. "When you came to this house, you were sick." Helen frowned. "I remember a cold." "You had more than a cold. You had a fever high enough to scare me, and your mother had been keeping you awake with coffee because she was afraid if you slept too long she wouldn't be able to wake you." Helen stared at her. "I don't remember that." "No. You slept most of the first 2 days." Mabel could see it now as clearly as the parlor in front of her. February 11th, 1932. A little after midnight. Snow had begun just before supper and was still coming down, fine and dry, catching in the seams of the porch steps. Mabel had been in the kitchen counting coins. That winter she counted coins the way other women counted prayers. 27 cents from room 2, $1 from Mr. Keller in room 4, with a promise of another $1 on Saturday if the machine works opened for even one shift. Nothing from room 6 because Mrs. Patterson's boy had needed medicine. $3.10 from the 2 railroad men sharing room 8. Mabel spread the coins on a towel because the sound of them against the table had begun to make her nervous. She was still counting when the knock came. At the door stood Maggie Avery, 36 years old, wearing a brown coat too thin for Iowa in February and carrying a girl who was almost too large to be carried. The girl's legs hung awkwardly. One shoe was unlaced. One hand wore a red knitted mitten. The other hand was bare and blue at the fingertips. Maggie did not ask for a room. She asked whether Mabel had a stove. That was the first thing. Not a bed, not a telephone, not food. A stove. Mabel let them in before asking anything else. The girl woke enough to protest when Mabel tried to take off her wet shoes. "That's Helen," Maggie said. "She's 16. She can be difficult when she's sick." "I can hear you," Helen muttered without opening her eyes. It was the first thing Mabel ever heard her say. Even then, she had thought there was something funny about the way Maggie looked down at her daughter, as if the girl had accomplished something remarkable merely by objecting. They put Helen on the narrow couch in the kitchen because it was the warmest room in the house. Mrs. Doherty, who had not yet moved across the alley and still rented room 3, came down in her robe and made mustard tea nobody wanted. Joseph Keller brought an extra blanket without being asked. Mabel heated water and rubbed Helen's bare hand between 2 towels until color returned to the fingers. Maggie stood beside the stove the whole time. She would not remove her coat. She would not sit. She kept looking toward the front hallway whenever the house creaked. At 2 in the morning, Mabel finally said what she had been thinking for an hour. "Is someone following you?" Maggie's face became blank. No. It was too quick. Mabel had run a boarding house long enough to recognize the difference between privacy and a lie. "All right," she said. Maggie looked surprised. "You don't want to know?" "I want $4 a week for the room and meals if you can pay it. 3 if you help with the washing. 2 if you do more than that. Tonight I want you to take your coat off before you fall over." For the first time, Maggie sat. She did not have $4. She had $1.83, 2 streetcar tokens, a comb, a little envelope of school papers, and a train ticket stub from Marshalltown. Mabel learned the amount not because Maggie volunteered it, but because Maggie emptied her purse onto the kitchen table as if submitting evidence. "I'll work," she said. "Most people here say that." "I mean it." "Most people mean it when they say it." Maggie's eyes hardened. "You think I'm asking for charity." "No, I think you're tired enough to pick a fight with the coal bucket." That startled a laugh out of Joseph Keller, who was still standing in the doorway in his undershirt. Maggie almost laughed too. That was the first crack in the wall. By morning, Helen's fever had fallen a little. By afternoon, Mabel knew more. Not everything. Maggie said they had come from a town near Marshalltown. Her husband, Earl Avery, had lost his job the previous summer and had been picking up whatever work he could find. Grain elevator, truck loading, road crew, a week here, 2 days there. She did not call him cruel. She did not call him a drunk. She said only that he had become a man who believed every person in the house should suffer exactly as much as he did. When there was money, he decided where it went. When there was no money, he decided whose fault that was. Helen had been doing well in school, better than well. A teacher wanted her to finish the year and apply for nurse training later. Earl wanted her working immediately. A cousin of his had written from Missouri saying there was a place for a girl in a laundry with board included. Earl decided Helen would go. Helen refused. Maggie supported her. The argument lasted 3 days. On the 4th, Earl sold Helen's winter coat to a second-hand dealer and told her that if she wanted to stay in school, she could learn what it cost to live without a man feeding her. Mabel had known men capable of worse. She had also known decent men made small and mean by months of idleness. She did not excuse Earl, but she understood why Maggie kept saying that the man she had married was not the man who had sent a 16-year-old girl into February without a coat. "What happened that night?" Mabel asked. Maggie stared at the kitchen stove. "He took her schoolbooks outside." "And?" "Put them in the wash boiler." Mabel waited. Maggie's jaw tightened. He was going to burn them. Helen, awake now on the couch, spoke without looking at either woman. "Mother hit him with a stove shovel." Mabel turned. Helen opened one eye. "Not hard." Maggie closed hers. "That depends on who tells it." "Did you hurt him?" Mabel asked. "I cut his forehead." That explained the blood Mabel would later see on Maggie's cuff, although she did not understand the connection until much later. Maggie had taken Helen, a few clothes, and whatever cash was in the kitchen jar. $23. Enough for train fare and not much else. She had a younger sister, Ruth, in Cedar Rapids, but she did not go there first. She was afraid Earl would think of Ruth immediately. So she came west to Des Moines, intending to disappear for a week or two before sending Helen on alone. Mabel did not approve of all of it. She said so. "You've taken his money." "Our money." "You've taken his daughter." "My daughter, too." "That doesn't make the trouble disappear." "I didn't say it did." Mabel remembered that answer because she had expected Maggie to defend herself. Instead, Maggie sounded exhausted. Nothing in those years disappeared because a person wanted it to. Debt did not disappear. Marriage did not disappear. A bad decision did not disappear. It simply followed you to the next town and waited until you stopped moving. Mabel gave them room 7, not because it was the best room, because it was the only one whose window could not be seen from the street. Helen slept for almost 18 hours. Maggie began working the next morning. At first, she worked for Mabel. Sheets, floors, breakfast dishes, a mountain of men's shirts soaked in a galvanized tub. By the 3rd day, Mabel noticed something about her. Maggie did not do any task halfway. She could be angry while scrubbing a floor, frightened while peeling potatoes, sick with worry while ironing pillowcases, but the floor was clean, the potatoes were thinly peeled, and the pillowcases came off the board sharp enough to fold themselves. Mrs. Doherty said it was a waste of temper. "If I had that much anger," she told Maggie, "I'd save some for summer. Keeps the mosquitoes off." Maggie laughed then, a real laugh. Helen recovered quickly. The girl remembered more of those weeks than she had admitted to Mabel in 1938, but memory had preserved strange things. She remembered the smell of bacon fat in the kitchen. She remembered Joseph Keller teaching her to shuffle cards one-handed. She remembered Mrs. Doherty letting her hem a blue dress and then quietly undoing the stitches after Helen went upstairs. She remembered Mabel telling her to stop reading at the breakfast table because people deserved to see the face of the person consuming their last biscuit. What she did not know was how much had been arranged around her. Mabel visited the school office on a wet Monday morning carrying Helen's papers in a brown envelope. The school secretary looked at the transfer record, looked at Mabel, and said the girl would need an address. 7 Reed House, Mabel said. "That isn't a street address." "Then write mine." "Your family?" No. Guardian? No. The secretary raised an eyebrow. Mabel had little patience for eyebrows before lunch. She is 16 years old. She reads Latin better than I read the newspaper. And if you make her miss another week because her father is out of work and her mother is scared, then in 10 years none of us gets to complain that the country is going to pieces. The secretary stared at her. Then she wrote down the address. Helen returned to school 2 days later. She hated it. Not the school itself, being new, being poor in a building where poverty had suddenly become common enough that everyone was trying hard not to notice it. Her shoes were wrong for the weather. Her dress had been altered from one of Maggie's. She had no proper notebook and used the blank backs of old boarding house account sheets for arithmetic. On her first afternoon, 2 girls asked whether the Reed boarding house was one of those places where unemployed men slept 4 to a room. Helen came home furious. Maggie wanted to pull her from school immediately. Mabel refused to let either of them make the decision while angry. "Eat first," she said. "I don't want supper," Helen answered. "You can hate everybody after meatloaf." "I don't eat meatloaf." "You did yesterday." "That was different. The meatloaf hasn't changed its politics." Joseph Keller laughed so hard he choked on his coffee. Helen stayed in school. Within 2 weeks, she had found the library. Within 3, a biology teacher had discovered her. His name was Mr. Halpern, a thin man with a permanently ink-stained thumb who believed anyone capable of memorizing the bones of the hand for amusement should consider medicine. Nursing was more realistic. He gave Helen old anatomy pamphlets from a hospital training program. She read them upstairs in room 7 after Maggie went to sleep. Mabel often saw the light under the door at midnight. Once she knocked and told Helen kerosene cost money. The next morning she moved the girl's chair nearer the window. That was the kind of thing Mabel did and forgot. Helen did not forget it. At the time, however, none of them knew how little time the girl had left in that room. On February 28th, Earl Avery arrived in Des Moines. Mabel knew him before he gave his name. He came at breakfast. The table was full. Joseph Keller had found 2 days of work unloading freight and was eating like a man trying to store Thursday for the rest of the week. Mrs. Doherty was arguing with another boarder about whether canned peaches counted as fruit after Christmas. Helen had already left for school. Maggie was carrying a pot from the kitchen. The knock came. Mabel opened the door. The man on the porch was not large. That surprised her later. In Maggie's fear, she had imagined him large. Earl Avery was perhaps 40, narrow-shouldered, clean-shaven, wearing a dark work coat with one button missing. There was a pale line near his hair where the cut had healed. He removed his cap. "Morning. I'm looking for my wife." Mabel felt Maggie stop moving behind her. Not a sound, but Mabel knew. "What's her name?" "Margaret Avery." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Never heard of her." It was not a heroic lie. Mabel did not feel brave. Her mouth went dry. She was aware of every person at the table listening without turning around. Earl looked past her. "Maggie?" he called. Nobody answered. Mabel stepped into the doorway and pulled the door partly closed behind her. "You're letting the cold in." He looked at her. "I was told a woman and girl came here 2 weeks ago. Women and girls come here every week. From Marshalltown." "Then you'd better ask in Marshalltown." His face changed. Not rage, something more tired. "You don't understand." "No, I don't. She took my daughter." Mabel remembered that sentence, not because of what Earl meant, because behind the door Maggie made a small sound, almost a breath, almost grief. Earl continued, "I haven't come to hurt anybody. I want Helen home." "Then perhaps Helen should decide where home is." "She's 16. "Yes." "That's a child. Old enough to know whether someone burned her school books." Silence. Mabel had shown too much. Earl knew it. His eyes moved to the crack of the door. Mabel pushed it closed another inch. For a moment she believed he might force his way inside. He did not. Instead he put his cap back on. "Tell Maggie I didn't burn them." Mabel said nothing. "I put them in the boiler. I was angry. I took them back out." "That's a small distinction." "Maybe." He looked toward the upstairs windows. "Tell her my sister's place is still open for Helen. Tell her I got 3 days at the elevator. Tell her she can come home." Then he walked away. Mabel stood on the porch until he turned the corner. When she went back inside, nobody at the breakfast table spoke. Maggie was in the kitchen. The coffee pot was on the floor. Coffee had spread beneath the stove. Maggie stared at it as though she did not understand how it got there. He found us. Mabel picked up the pot. He found the house. Same thing. No. Maggie looked at her. You don't know him. No, I know you. That was when Maggie began to cry. Not loudly, not for long. She pressed her fists to her eyes like a tired child and cried for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she stopped. By lunchtime, she had a plan. Helen would go to Ruth in Cedar Rapids. Not next week, that night. Maggie would remain in Des Moines. If Earl watched the station or followed her, he would see only Maggie. Mrs. Doherty called it foolish. Joseph Keller called it smart. Mabel called it unfinished. How long will Helen stay with your sister? Until I know what I'm doing. That isn't a length of time. It's the only one I have. Helen objected. She wanted Maggie to come too. Maggie refused. For the first time since they arrived, mother and daughter fought in front of the others. Helen accused Maggie of always deciding what was best without asking. Maggie accused Helen of thinking bravery and stubbornness were the same thing. Helen said she would rather go back to Earl than be passed from woman to woman like a parcel. Maggie slapped the table so hard the sugar bowl jumped. Then Mabel did something neither of them expected. She handed Helen the metal tag marked 7. Put this on your valise. Helen looked at it. Why? Because that's your room. I won't be here. No, but if your mother gets foolish and forgets where she belongs, she'll see the empty hook upstairs and remember. Maggie stared at her. Mabel continued. And if you decide everybody in this world is sending you away, you look at that tag and remember one place did not. Helen said nothing. She wired the tag to her valise. Before the bus left, Maggie scratched 3 letters into the back with the point of Mabel's sewing scissors. M-R-H. Maggie Reed Helen, Helen later assumed. She was wrong. Maggie never told her what the letters meant. Mabel had forgotten them until that October night 6 years later. Maggie had said the words under her breath as she scratched. My room, her home. It was not good grammar. It was not meant to be. It was a promise. Helen left for Cedar Rapids carrying the valise, her school papers, 2 sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, and a pair of red mittens Mrs. Doherty had bought at a 5 and 10 because nobody could stand looking at the one bare hand anymore. Mabel watched the bus pull away. Maggie stood beside her. Neither woman waved after the bus turned the corner. That evening, room 7 was empty for the first time since Maggie arrived. Mabel thought it would stay empty for a night. It stayed empty for 4 months. Not because Maggie could not afford another room, because she refused to sleep in her daughter's bed until she had earned the right to bring her back. For the next week, Maggie worked as if she could purchase certainty by the hour. She took a morning cleaning job at a cafeteria near the courthouse. 3 mornings later, a woman who did alterations for a department store gave her piecework hemming slips and repairing seams. At night, she washed linens for Mabel. She slept on the small couch in the kitchen. Mabel offered room 7 twice. Maggie refused twice. That's Helen's room. She isn't in it. She will be. Mabel did not argue a third time. Every evening after supper, Maggie wrote to Ruth. Every few days, a letter came back. Helen had started school in Cedar Rapids. Helen hated the algebra teacher. Helen had found the hospital library and somehow persuaded a nurse to show her a training manual. Helen wanted her blue dress. Helen said Ruth snored. Those small complaints did more for Maggie than any promise could have done. A girl who complained about algebra was a girl with enough safety left in her life to be annoyed by algebra. Then, on March 2nd, a different letter came. Mabel knew something was wrong before Maggie opened it. The envelope had been forwarded twice. There was a grease mark across one corner. Maggie read the first page standing beside the kitchen sink. Then she sat down. Ruth had seen Earl. He had not forced his way into her house. He had not made a scene. He had come in daylight and spoken to her on the porch. He knew Helen was there. He said he wanted to see his daughter. Ruth had refused. Earl said he would return Saturday. Maggie read the letter 3 times. Mabel waited. What now? I go there. And then? I take Helen somewhere else. Where? Maggie rubbed both hands over her face. I don't know. For all her planning, she had reached the edge of what $23 and fear could accomplish. There was no secret fortune, no wealthy aunt in Chicago, no lawyer waiting to rescue them. Ruth and her husband lived in a rented duplex and had 2 children of their own. They could keep Helen for a while. They could not vanish with her. Mabel asked whether Maggie wanted to speak to someone at the courthouse. Maggie laughed once. With what money? Advice doesn't always cost money. Everything costs money. Sometimes they just tell you the price later. Mabel understood the feeling even when she disagreed with the sentence. The following morning, Maggie went to the station to price tickets. She returned with wet shoes and no plan. By noon, she had decided Helen should go to Omaha, where a former neighbor named Nora Bell worked in a laundry and rented a room from cousins. Mabel asked whether Nora had agreed. She will. You haven't asked. I know her. That isn't the same thing. Maggie turned on her. What would you have me do? Mabel had no answer. That was the difficulty. It is easy to criticize a desperate person's plan when you have a better one. Mabel had only objections. Maggie needed train fare to Cedar Rapids, then fares farther west for herself and Helen. She needed food. She needed enough left to arrive somewhere without immediately begging. She counted what she had. $9.12. Not enough. That evening, Mabel made her own mistake. She counted the mortgage money at the kitchen table, $54.80. The amount represented 4 weeks of scraping together every payment the house could produce. It was not the entire mortgage installment, but the bank had agreed to accept it with the rest due before the end of the month. Mabel placed the bills in a white envelope. She wrote, First Iowa Trust on the front. Then Mrs. Patterson's boy began vomiting upstairs. Mabel left the envelope on the table and went to help. By the time she returned an hour later, Maggie had gone to her cleaning job. The envelope was where Mabel had left it. She put it in the desk drawer and locked the desk. The next morning, the envelope contained $8. For several minutes, Mabel simply stared. She counted twice, then a third time. She searched the drawer, the floor, the wastebasket, her apron pockets. She knew exactly how much had been there. She had counted it in stacks of 5. $46.80 were gone. It was more money than some of her boarders had seen together in months. Mabel stood alone in the kitchen, hearing pans and footsteps in the rooms above her. She knew who had taken it. There was no proof. There did not need to be. Maggie was gone. So was her coat. So was the small cardboard suitcase she had borrowed from Mrs. Doherty. On the table sat her meal card, $12.40 unpaid. Mabel picked it up. For one ugly minute, she hated Maggie Avery. Not because Maggie had stolen, because she had stolen from a woman who had let her in. There are betrayals made larger by the amount of money involved. This was not one of them. $46 was enormous to Mabel, but the number was not what hurt. The hurt was the kitchen couch, the washed sheets, the school address, the red mittens. The lie at the front door. Mabel had believed that by helping Maggie, she had joined her side of the world. The empty envelope told her Maggie had never believed there were sides. Only doors that were open and doors that might close. Mrs. Doherty came downstairs at 7 and found Mabel sitting at the table. What happened? Nothing. Mabel. Nothing you can fix. Mrs. Doherty noticed the open desk, then the envelope, then the meal card. Her expression changed. No. Mabel said nothing. That woman? Keep your voice down. She stole from you? Keep your voice down. Joseph Keller appeared in the doorway, fastening his work shirt. What's wrong? Nothing, Mabel said. Mrs. Doherty was not built for secrecy before breakfast. Maggie took the mortgage money. Joseph stopped. Mabel wanted to throw the coffee pot at both of them. Within 20 minutes, nearly everyone in the house knew. That was how boarding houses worked. Walls created rooms. They did not create privacy. Mr. Pike from room 2 said she should call the police. Mrs. Patterson said perhaps Maggie intended to return it. A railroad man said a thief always intended to return money until the train left. Joseph Keller stayed silent. Mabel poured coffee. Nobody ate much. The missing money sat at the table more heavily than any person. At 9, her daughter Clara arrived. Clara did not live at the boarding house. She had escaped it, as she sometimes put it, by marrying Harold Bennett and moving 12 blocks away. Mabel disliked the word escaped. Clara insisted she meant nothing by it. That made Mabel dislike it more. Harold worked as a clerk at First Iowa Trust. Not an officer. Not a man who decided mortgages. But close enough to paper that Clara always seemed to know when Mabel was late before Mabel told her. She walked into the kitchen wearing a gray hat and the expression she used when she had come prepared to be reasonable. Mabel would have preferred anger. "I heard." "From whom?" "Mrs. Doherty sent Billy across." "I'll kill her." "No, you won't." "Then I'll raise her rent." "She hasn't paid you in 3 weeks." That was true. Mabel hated that too. Clara sat opposite her. "How much?" Mabel told her. Clara went very still. $46.80. "Mama." "Don't. You have to report it." "No." "Why?" "Because I said no." "That isn't a reason. It was good enough when you were 12. I'm 38. Then you've had 26 years to learn when to stop asking." Clara leaned back. "You're going to lose this house one foolish kindness at a time." The sentence landed with a precision neither woman expected. Mabel looked at her daughter. Clara immediately regretted it. Mabel could see that. But regret does not pull words back into a mouth. "You think that's what I've been doing?" Mabel asked. Clara rubbed her gloved fingers together. "I think you charge people less than it costs to keep them. I think half the city knows they can come here with a sad story and get soup. I think you let men owe you rent because you remember Papa being out of work in 1914. I think you let women stay because you can't bear to put children outside. And I think the bank does not accept sad stories." Mabel stood. "Your coffee's getting cold." "Mama." "Drink it or don't." Clara's eyes filled. That made Mabel angrier because tears suggested someone had been injured, and Mabel did not want to decide which of them it was. "You think I don't care about this house?" Clara asked. "I think you left it. I got married. You couldn't get out fast enough. Because it was never ours." The kitchen went silent. Even the people listening from the hallway had the decency to become invisible. Clara lowered her voice. "When Papa died, I was 15. Within 4 months, you had strangers sleeping in his room. Within a year, there were 8 people at our table. I couldn't walk downstairs in my nightdress. I couldn't invite a school friend without 3 boarders asking who her father was. Every room became somebody else's emergency." Mabel stared at her. She had heard pieces of this before, never the whole thing. "I had a mortgage," she said. "I know." "I had no husband's wages." "I know." "I kept a roof over us." "I know." "Then what exactly would you have had me do?" Clara looked down. "I don't know." It was the same answer Mabel had given herself about Maggie. No better plan, only pain about the one that had been chosen. Clara stood. "Harold can ask whether the bank will take a smaller payment this month." "No." "Why not?" "Because your husband has already done enough explaining for me." "He doesn't mind." "I do." Clara's mouth tightened. "Pride is expensive." Mabel looked at Maggie's meal card on the table. "Yes," she said, "it is." Clara left without kissing her. At noon, Mabel walked to the bank. She took the $8 remaining in the envelope. She added $9 from the grocery tin. She added $5 Joseph Keller insisted she borrow. $22, less than half of what she had planned to bring. The lobby smelled of wet wool and ink. There was no dramatic crowd, no shouting, just men and women waiting to speak quietly about money they did not have. Mabel stood behind a farmer, holding his hat against his chest, and in front of a seamstress she recognized from church. When her turn came, the assistant cashier looked at the $22 and then at her account. He was polite. That made it worse. He explained that the bank could not continue accepting irregular amounts indefinitely. Mabel explained that she understood. He said there would be a late charge. Mabel said she understood. He asked when she expected the balance. Mabel said she did not know. He lowered his voice. "Mrs. Reed, you have equity in the property. Selling may be better than letting arrears grow." Mabel looked at him. The word selling felt obscene. The house was not an investment to her. It was where Clara had learned to walk, where Frank Reed had died after 3 days of pneumonia, where Mabel had washed his body because the undertaker could not come until morning, where she had taken down family photographs from 2 bedrooms and put numbers on the doors because the mortgage remained whether grief did or not. "I'll bring more by the end of the month," she said. The assistant cashier did not argue. He stamped the payment slip. When Mabel left the bank, Clara was waiting outside. She had probably learned from Harold that Mabel was there. Neither mentioned it. Clara looked at the receipt in Mabel's hand. How bad? I've survived worse conversations. Did you tell them the money was stolen? No. Why? Mabel folded the receipt. Because if she reported Maggie, the police might find her before she found Helen. Because Earl might learn where Helen had gone. Because a woman with no money and a theft complaint behind her would have fewer places to stand. Because Mabel was furious and still could not bring herself to make Maggie's choices narrower than they already were. But there was another reason, one she did not admit until years later. If Mabel reported the theft, then the story became simple. Maggie was a thief. Mabel was the victim. Simple stories are comforting. They are also often incomplete. I don't know, Mabel told Clara. That afternoon she returned home and wrote "paid in full" on Maggie's meal card. Not because the debt had vanished, because she was angry enough to want the account closed. She put the card in the desk. A week later, it was gone. Mabel assumed she had thrown it away. She did not know Maggie had come back for it. Maggie returned to the Reed boarding house on March 17th at 5 in the morning. Mabel was in the kitchen lighting the stove when the back door opened. Maggie stepped inside. Her hair was wet with sleet. There was a bruise along her jaw. Her right cuff was stained dark brown. Mabel reached for the poker, then she recognized her. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Mabel set down the poker. Maggie closed the door. You should call the police. Yes. I took your money. Yes. All of it except what was left. Yes. I can pay you back. No, you can't. Maggie's face crumpled for half a second, then hardened again. Helen's safe. Mabel hated the relief that moved through her. Where? I won't tell you. Good. That surprised Maggie. Mabel pointed to the chair. Sit down. I didn't come for breakfast. I didn't offer breakfast. Maggie sat. The story came in pieces. She had gone to Cedar Rapids. Earl came Saturday exactly as he said he would. Maggie met him outside Ruth's house. He wanted to see Helen. Maggie refused. They argued. Earl grabbed Maggie's sleeve. Ruth's husband came outside. They were shoving. Nobody was badly hurt. The blood on Maggie's cuff belonged to Ruth's husband, whose nose had been broken. The bruise on Maggie's jaw came from falling against the porch rail. Helen had watched from the upstairs window. That was what changed Maggie's plan. She had believed she was protecting her daughter from Earl. Instead, she had carried the fight to Ruth's porch and made Helen watch it. That night, Maggie told Helen the truth about the money. Not Mabel's money, the $23 she had taken from home. Helen said she did not want to spend the next year running from one relative to another. She wanted school. She wanted a bed that belonged to the same address for more than 3 weeks. She wanted her father to stop deciding where she would go. She wanted her mother to stop deciding too. Mabel listened. What did you do? I listened to her. It had clearly cost Maggie something to say that. They arranged for Helen to stay with Ruth through the school term. Earl was told he could write. Helen would decide whether to answer. Maggie would return to Des Moines, work, repay Mabel, and then find a room in Cedar Rapids when she had enough. And the $46? Mabel asked. Maggie looked down. I bought the tickets before Helen changed the plan. I paid Nora in Omaha 2 weeks' board in advance because I thought we were going there. I gave Ruth grocery money. I paid a doctor for Helen's cough. There's $18 left. She placed the money on the table. Mabel looked at it. You stole 46 and brought back 18. Yes. You want praise for arithmetic? No. Mabel's anger returned so quickly she stood to keep from throwing something. You could have asked me. You didn't have it to give. That was not your decision. I know. You took my mortgage payment. I know. You could have cost me this house. I know. Stop saying you know. Maggie flinched. Mabel had never seen her flinch before. Then Maggie said the sentence that Mabel remembered for the rest of her life. I knew what it could cost you. I did it anyway. There was no excuse in it, no plea, no claim that motherhood made theft noble. Just the fact. Mabel sat again. Outside, a milk truck rattled along the street. The house began waking one pipe and floorboard at a time. What do you expect me to do? Mabel asked. Whatever you decide. That isn't an answer. It's the only honest one I have. Mabel looked at the $18, then at Maggie. She thought of Clara saying one foolish kindness at a time. She thought of the bank lobby. She thought of Helen at the breakfast table saying she would rather go home than be passed around like a parcel. Finally, Mabel pushed $6 back across the table. Maggie stared at it. What is that? Your first week's wages. I don't work for you. You do now. Maggie's eyes filled with sudden fury. I am not taking your charity after stealing from you. This is not charity. What would you call it? Employment. You'll wash linens, cook 3 mornings, and help me collect rent from men who suddenly remember their pockets when I send someone meaner than I am. Despite herself, Maggie almost smiled. Mabel pointed at the money. You need to eat. You need streetcar fare. And you need enough dignity left to work tomorrow. Take it. Maggie did. She worked at the Reed boarding house for the next 4 months. She slept on the kitchen couch for the first 3 weeks. Then one night, Mabel found her asleep, sitting upright in a chair, and ordered her into room 7. Maggie stood in the doorway for nearly a minute before entering. After that, she slept there. She paid Mabel back. Not quickly, not cleanly. $2 one week, 50 cents the next. Nothing during a week when the cafeteria cut her hours. $5 after she repaired 27 dresses for a store basement sale. Every payment went into a separate envelope. Mabel marked the amount on the front. Neither woman spoke about forgiveness. Mabel did not forgive Maggie all at once. Some mornings she liked her. Some mornings she saw the bank receipt and disliked her again. That too was part of the truth. Mercy did not erase arithmetic. But by summer the house had changed around Maggie. She became the person who knew which boarder had eaten and which one claimed not to be hungry because his rent was late. She repaired cuffs. She cut stale bread into cubes for pudding. She learned that Joseph Keller's silence meant he was worried and Mrs. Doherty's talking meant the same thing. On Sundays she wrote Helen. Sometimes Helen wrote back to Mabel too. Short notes. School was going well. Mr. Halpern had sent her a recommendation. Ruth's children were noisy. She still wanted to be a nurse. One note ended with a sentence Mabel kept for years in the drawer with the mortgage receipts. Thank you for making Mother let me go to school when both of us were too angry to think. Mabel did not remember making anyone do anything. She remembered meatloaf. That was the problem with the moments that change a life. They rarely announce themselves when they happen. By July, the money Maggie had taken was almost repaid, almost mattered. The final $8 sat between them one evening in the kitchen while heat pressed against the screens and moths struck the porch light. Maggie had received a letter from Helen that morning. The girl had passed her examinations. Ruth had found her a summer job helping at a doctor's office, mostly cleaning and carrying files, but the doctor had promised to teach her how to take temperatures properly and keep a chart. Maggie read the letter twice. Then she put $8 on the table. Mabel looked at it. Keep 2. No. Your shoes are coming apart. They've been coming apart since March. They haven't finished yet. Maggie. No. Mabel counted the bills. The debt was paid. The theft was not undone. Those were different things. Maggie understood that better than anyone. I'll leave next Thursday, she said. For Cedar Rapids? Yes. You found a room? Ruth knows a widow with an attic bedroom. Work? The doctor's wife thinks she can get me sewing. Mabel nodded. Neither woman said they would miss the other. They had not built that kind of friendship. Some friendships are made from shared pleasure. Theirs had been made from winter, money, and an offense neither of them was willing to forget. On Maggie's last morning, Mabel gave her the meal card. Maggie turned it over. Paid in full. M.R. You wrote this before I came back? Yes. Why? I was angry. That makes no sense. It did at the time. Maggie studied the card. Can I keep it? I thought you'd thrown it away. I took it from the desk. Of course you did. That produced the smallest of smiles. Maggie put the card in her purse. Then she reached into her coat pocket and placed a key on the table. Room 7. You keep that, Mabel said. Why? So I don't have to replace it when you come back and steal something else. Maggie laughed. The laugh surprised both women. She kept the key. Years later, Mabel wondered what became of it. It was not in Helen's box. Perhaps Maggie lost it. Perhaps she carried it until the metal wore smooth. Perhaps it lay somewhere under Iowa soil with other things people had once believed too important to lose. Maggie went to Cedar Rapids. For a while, she and Helen wrote regularly. Helen finished high school. She worked 1 year before entering a hospital training program because there was no money to begin immediately. Maggie sewed, cleaned, cooked in a boarding kitchen, and once spent 6 weeks packing canned corn when another job disappeared. Earl wrote to Helen. At first, Maggie passed the letters on. Helen answered too. The first was polite, the second was angry. After that, there was silence for several months. Then Earl sent another letter to Maggie instead. Mabel knew because Maggie forwarded part of it to her. Not the whole letter, only one paragraph copied onto a sheet of cheap paper. Earl wrote that he had work again. He said he regretted the schoolbooks. He said he had been ashamed and had made everybody in the house pay for his shame. He said he wanted his daughter to know he had not stopped being her father because she stopped answering. Mabel read those lines several times. She did not know what to think. She wrote back to Maggie only one sentence about them. That is Helen's letter, not yours. Maggie did not answer for 6 weeks. When she finally did, she wrote that she had given it to Helen. Mabel believed her. That belief turned out to be only partly true. By 1934, the letters became less frequent. People who survive a crisis often imagine the afterward will be a clean, straight road. It rarely is. Maggie and Helen moved twice. Helen entered nurse training. Maggie took work wherever she found it. Mabel filled room 7 with other people. A young married couple who stayed 6 weeks while the husband worked a paving job. A school teacher whose salary arrived late 3 months in a row. A widower named Mr. Barnes who snored loudly enough to rattle the glass and left after Mabel informed him that nobody in the house had slept since Easter. Life covered old events without erasing them. Then, in 1935, Mabel received the first postal money order, $4, no letter. The sender line said M. Avery. Mabel stared at it. The old debt had been paid 3 years before. She wrote to Maggie's last address. The letter came back. Moved, no forwarding address. 2 months later, another money order arrived, $3, then $5. Then nothing for nearly a year. In 1936, $7 arrived from Omaha. In early 1937, $2 came from Cedar Rapids. Mabel put every one in the bank. She did not understand them. At first she thought Maggie was trying to pay interest on the stolen money. That irritated her. Then she wondered whether the money belonged to Helen. That worried her. Eventually she stopped guessing. By then, the boarding house itself was changing. The worst years had passed without becoming easy years. Some men returned to work, others did not. Public projects brought wages into households that had gone too long without them. New faces arrived in town. Old boarders left for jobs in other cities. Mabel found that recovery could be almost as disruptive as collapse. During the deepest part of the Depression, people had needed cheap rooms desperately. As work returned, some wanted apartments, privacy, bathrooms not shared by 6 strangers. The house needed repairs Mabel had postponed for years. The roof leaked near room 5. 2 windows had warped. The furnace was temperamental. The back steps had been repaired so many times, Joseph Keller once said the only original part left was the direction they faced. Mabel borrowed against the property in 1935 to replace the furnace and settle old taxes. That decision mattered more to the eventual loss of the house than Maggie's theft ever did. Mabel knew it, Clara knew it, the bank knew it, but human beings prefer a single cause when lives unravel. For a while, Mabel privately blamed the missing $46 anyway. It was easier than blaming 10 years of small shortages. Then she blamed herself. That was easier still. By 1938, she could no longer keep up. The house was too large for the income it produced. She was 63 and tired of carrying coal, chasing payments, mending curtains, and lying awake when somebody coughed in the room above her. The bank did not throw her into the street. There was no sheriff at the door. There were meetings, letters, figures, a proposed sale, a buyer, Clara urging her to accept before arrears swallowed what little value remained. Mabel resisted for months. Then one morning in August, she climbed the stairs carrying clean sheets and had to sit halfway up because her heart was hammering. She sat on the step where Helen had once left a schoolbook. For the first time, she allowed herself to think a sentence she had treated as betrayal. I do not want to do this anymore. 2 weeks later, she agreed to the sale. She would leave with a modest amount after the mortgage and other debts were settled. Not enough to buy another house, enough to rent something small. Clara wanted her to live with her and Harold. Mabel refused. They argued, then argued again. At last, Clara found her a furnished 2-room flat above a bakery 6 blocks away. Mabel complained about the stairs. Clara pointed out that the Reed boarding house had more stairs. Mabel complained about the smell of bread. Clara stared at her until Mabel admitted she was being ridiculous. The move was set for the first week of November. Then Helen Avery arrived with Maggie's letter. Now, in the bare parlor, Mabel unfolded the pages again. Helen waited. You said you'd tell me what you saw first, she said. I did. Then read it. Mabel hesitated. Helen's jaw tightened. Please. So Mabel began. She did not read every word aloud. Some sentences belonged to Maggie even in death, but she read enough. The letter had been written in May of 1938, 2 months before Maggie became too ill to work. Mabel, if Helen ever comes looking for me, you must not tell her what I did until you know whether she has somewhere safe to go afterward. I do not mean a bed. Helen has always been good at finding a bed when she needs one. I mean somewhere inside herself that will still be standing when she is angry with me. Helen looked away at that. Mabel continued. Maggie wrote about the $46. She did not soften it. She called it theft. She wrote that she had carried the shame of it longer than she carried the fear that caused it. She wrote that Mabel had every right to report her and did not. She wrote that being allowed to work after returning had been worse in some ways than being punished. Punishment would have given her something simple to resist. Work forced her to look at Mabel every morning and remember what she had done. Helen listened without moving. You knew she took money, she asked. No. She never told you? Not that money. Mabel nodded and read on. Then came the part about Earl. Maggie admitted she had hidden letters, not all of them, 3. 1 in late 1933, 2 in 1934. Helen turned sharply. She told me he stopped writing. I know. No, you don't know. Helen stood. The coffee cup rocked on the floor beside her chair. She told me he didn't care whether I was alive. She said after I started training, he never wrote again. Mabel held the letter. Helen. What did the letter say? I haven't reached that. Then reach it. The anger in her voice was so like Maggie's that Mabel almost smiled. She did not. Maggie had summarized the letters. Earl wanted Helen to come home. He had steady work by then. He had stopped living in the old house and rented a room near the elevator. He wrote that he would not ask Helen to leave school. He wrote that he had been wrong. He also wrote things that frightened Maggie. He still described Helen's choices as rebellion. He still blamed Maggie for turning the girl against him. He still believed that if Helen returned, the family could be put back where it belonged. Maggie read the letters and decided they would confuse Helen, so she kept them. She told herself she was protecting her daughter. Years later, she admitted in the letter she understood that she was protecting herself too. If Helen saw remorse in Earl, she might decide her mother had made the wrong choice. If Helen forgave him, Maggie would have to live with the fact that forgiveness had been possible for him and perhaps not for her. If Helen went home, Maggie might be left alone. The last confession was the one that broke Helen's expression. Mabel stopped reading. Helen stood beside the empty window. Rain streaked the glass. My mother told me she didn't need anyone, Helen said. Mabel waited. She said women got into trouble because they needed people too much. Your mother said many things she wanted to be true. Helen laughed bitterly. Did she keep the letters? Yes. Where are they? Mabel turned the page. Maggie had written that she burned the first 2 in 1936 after learning Earl had died of pneumonia the previous winter. The third she kept. It had been in the same box as Mabel's letter. Helen stared. There was no other letter. Mabel looked down. Maggie had written where it was hidden, inside the lining of the valise beneath the metal tag. Helen grabbed the bag. It was old, not the valise she had carried to Mabel's door that night, but the same one she had taken from Des Moines at 16. The leatherette had cracked along the edges. One clasp had been replaced with string. Helen turned it over. The lining had been repaired near one corner with black thread. Mabel recognized the stitching, Maggie's. Helen used Mabel's sewing scissors from the kitchen to open the seam. A folded envelope slid out. No stamp, no postmark. It had never been mailed either. Across the front was written, Helen Avery. Helen sat down. For a long time she did not open it. Mabel looked away. Some moments require a witness. Others require the witness to become furniture. At last Helen unfolded the paper. She read silently. Mabel watched her face. There was no dramatic collapse, no cry, only a tightening around the eyes. Then Helen covered her mouth with one hand. The letter was dated November 1934. Earl wrote that he had no right to ask her to forget. He did not ask forgiveness. He wrote that he had been frightened by being unable to provide and had treated the people nearest him as though they were responsible for his failure. He wrote that he had burned one of Helen's schoolbooks after all, the anatomy pamphlet. He had lied to Mabel on the porch. He wrote that he was ashamed of that lie because it had been easier to admit anger than destruction. He wrote that he had bought another anatomy book second-hand and enclosed a claim ticket from a shop where it could be collected. The ticket, of course, was useless now. The shop might not even exist. But Helen held the letter as though the book itself sat in her lap. At the bottom, Earl had written one more thing. Finish your training. I won't ask you home again. If you ever come, let it be because you chose the road yourself. Helen read that line 3 times. Then she folded the letter. My mother took this from me. Yes. He died thinking I had read it. Probably. And I spent 4 years thinking he never changed. Yes. Helen stood again. She paced to the hallway and back. Her anger needed distance. The parlor had too little. I don't know what to do with this. You don't have to do anything tonight. She's dead. I know. I can't even ask her why. She wrote why. That isn't the same as hearing her say it. No. Mabel folded Maggie's letter. Helen stopped moving. What else? There is more. Of course there is. Mabel almost told her to sit down, then decided a 22-year-old nurse who had traveled across Iowa carrying a dead woman's secrets could choose whether to stand. She read the final page. Maggie explained the money orders. They had not been interest. They had not been repayment for the theft. That debt, she wrote, had been settled in 1932. The later money was for something else, something Mabel had forgotten completely. During Helen's first weeks at the Reed boarding house, Mr. Halpern had required a laboratory fee and 2 books the school could not supply. Helen had not told Maggie. She intended to quit the biology course. Mabel found out from the teacher. She paid $3.60. Helen protested. Mabel told her it was a loan. Then she forgot about it. Helen did not. When Helen began nurse training, there were shoes, uniforms, examination charges, and weeks when she could not earn enough outside the hospital to cover everything. Maggie helped when she could. So did Ruth. But twice, when there was no money, Maggie remembered Mabel's $3.60. She told Helen that Mabel had once invested in her and expected a return. It was a ridiculous sentence. It worked. Helen stayed in training. Years later, when she began receiving wages, Maggie persuaded her to send small amounts to Mabel. Helen had believed the money was repayment of old boarding house debts. Maggie had allowed her to believe it. Mabel lowered the page. Helen stared. I sent those. I know now. I thought Mother owed you. She did once. She told me you had carried us for months. I carried her. You were gone. She said there were food bills, coal, doctor bills. There were some. Helen shook her head. How much did we owe? $12.40 for meals, $46.80 stolen. Both were paid. And the money orders? Were yours. Helen's face changed from anger to disbelief. You deposited them? I didn't know whose they were. You never asked? I tried once. Helen sat slowly. Mabel continued reading. The final lines were addressed not to Mabel, but unmistakably, through Mabel, to Helen. Maggie wrote that she had spent years deciding what her daughter was strong enough to know. It had been another form of control, different from Earl's, but control all the same. She wrote that poverty had taught her to treat every decision as an emergency, and eventually she no longer knew how to stop. She had decided where Helen would sleep, what she would be told, whose letters she would read, which truths could wait. She had called all of it protection. Some of it had been. Some had been fear wearing a respectable coat. Maggie did not ask Helen to forgive her. She asked only that Helen not turn her mother's mistakes into instructions for her own life. Then came the last paragraph. Mabel's voice changed as she read it. If she comes to you, tell her the truth about the money. Tell her I stole it. Tell her you were angry. Do not make me better than I was because I am dead. But tell her one other thing if you can. Tell her that the night she left room 7, I believed I had ruined everything. You gave her that little numbered tag and told her she had a room even when she wasn't in it. I have carried that sentence longer than I carried the key. I think it is the reason I eventually understood that letting someone go is not the same as sending them away. Mabel stopped. The rain had softened. The house was so quiet she could hear water dripping from the gutter outside. Helen looked down at the tag in her palm. For years it had been a mysterious piece of metal her mother refused to explain. Now the number had become a room, then a promise, then an accusation, then something else. Helen rubbed her thumb over the scratched letters on the back. My room, her home, Mabel said. Helen looked up. What? That's what the letters meant, M-R-H. Your mother scratched them into the tag at the bus station. My room, her home. Helen closed her fist around it. She kept it 6 years. So did you. I didn't know why. Most people don't know why they keep things until the person who gave them the thing is gone. Helen's eyes filled. This time she let the tears come. Not many. Maggie had taught her economy in everything, even grief. After a while, Helen wiped her face. You said she stayed here 4 months after I left. Yes. Did she talk about me? Constantly. Helen gave a broken little laugh. That sounds right. She complained about your handwriting, your temper, your refusal to eat crusts. She read every school report twice. Did she ever say she wanted me to come back? Every day. Then why didn't she? Mabel leaned forward. Because for once she understood wanting you back and asking you back were not the same thing. Helen looked at her. Something in her face softened. Not forgiveness, not yet. Perhaps never completely. But room appeared inside the anger. That was often the first change. Mabel stood. Come upstairs. Helen followed. The staircase complained under their weight exactly as it had in 1932. At the top, Mabel walked to the last door on the left. There was no number now, only the pale rectangle and 2 nail holes. Mabel opened the door. Room 7 held nothing except dust, a rolled rug, and a square of afternoon gray rain at the window. Helen stepped inside. She looked smaller there, not 16, but closer to the girl Mabel remembered. I thought it was bigger, Helen said. Everything is bigger when you're miserable. Helen smiled. She went to the window. This is where I studied? Mostly in that corner. There was a chair. Yes. And a washstand there. Yes. I remember Mother brushing my hair by the window. Mabel waited. Helen touched the wall where the bed had stood. I remember more than I thought. That happens. I remember being angry with her for sending me to Aunt Ruth. You were furious. I told her she wanted to get rid of me. I heard, Helen winced. Did she cry? Not where you could see. Helen nodded. Mabel reached into her apron pocket. She took out the brass door number. The 7 was heavier and larger than the luggage tag. She held it out. Helen shook her head. No. You came looking for room 7. It belongs to the house. The house won't care. You will. Mabel looked at the 2 nail holes. That is why I'm giving it away. Helen accepted the brass number. Now she held 2 7s. One small enough to travel, one large enough to mark a door. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Helen asked the question Mabel had been avoiding all evening. Did my mother taking that money make you lose this house? Mabel answered immediately. No. Helen searched her face. Are you sure? Yes. She wrote that it delayed your mortgage. It did. And Clara said, Mabel looked at her sharply. How do you know Clara? My mother wrote her name once. Mabel exhaled. Clara said many things when she was angry. So did I. Then why are you losing it? Because houses cost money even when people love them. Because I borrowed for repairs. Because I kept rents too low sometimes. Because the roof leaked. Because I am tired. Because the buyer offered enough to settle the mortgage before the bank settled it for me. Pick any 5. Helen looked around the room. You don't sound sorry. I am sorry. Then why? Being sorry to lose something is not the same as wanting to keep carrying it. Helen looked at her. Mabel realized the sentence was not only about houses. Helen realized it too. They were still standing in room 7 when the front door opened downstairs. Mabel heard the familiar sound of a key, followed by Clara's voice. Mama? Mabel closed her eyes. Helen glanced toward the hall. Should I go? No. If I let my daughter chase every visitor out of this house, she'd have finished the job 20 years ago. Mama! Clara called again. Up here! Clara appeared at the top of the stairs carrying a paper sack and wearing the same gray hat she had worn to the bank 6 years earlier, though the ribbon had been replaced. She stopped when she saw Helen. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you had company. This is Helen Avery. Clara's expression went still. She knew the name. Not from Helen. From Maggie. Mabel saw the recognition immediately. Helen saw it too. You knew my mother? Clara looked at Mabel first. That irritated Mabel. Don't ask me for permission. She's asking you. Clara shifted the sack to her other arm. I met her once. When? Helen asked. March of 1932. Mabel stared. You never told me that. You never asked. That is not an answer. Clara gave her a look that was almost affectionate. I learned from you. Helen waited. Clara set the paper sack on the floor. She came to our apartment. Harold was at work. She asked me not to report her to the police. Mabel felt the old anger rise again, transformed now by surprise. You knew she'd taken the money before she came back here. Yes. How long? 1 day. And you said nothing? She asked for 1 day. Mabel stared at her daughter. For years she had remembered Clara as the person insisting Maggie be reported. She had forgotten, or never known, that Clara had already made a different choice when the decision belonged to her alone. What did she tell you? Helen asked. Clara looked uncomfortable. That she had done something shameful because she was afraid. That she intended to come back. That if I called the police before morning, your father might learn where you were before she could settle things with your aunt. Why did she come to you? Because Harold worked at the bank. She thought I might hear about the missing payment before she got back. Mabel sat on the windowsill. You let me stand in my own kitchen believing you thought I was an idiot. Clara frowned. I did think you were being an idiot. Thank you. But not for the reason you thought. What reason was that? I thought you were going to forgive her too quickly. Mabel almost laughed. Too quickly? You always did that. I did not. Clara gave Helen a brief look, the look of a daughter inviting a stranger to witness the hopelessness of her mother. You did. You'd get furious, stomp around the kitchen, swear someone was never getting another meal on credit, then set a plate aside for him because his shift ended late. That is not forgiveness. That is preventing waste. Of course. For the first time that night, Helen laughed without pain behind it. The sound altered the empty room. Mabel heard what the house had been missing during its final week. Not furniture, people answering one another. Clara picked up the paper sack again. I brought sandwiches. I assumed you hadn't eaten. I had coffee. That isn't food. That is what I tell everyone else. Yes, it is. They went downstairs. Clara had brought egg sandwiches, 2 apples, and a small piece of spice cake wrapped in waxed paper. She had also brought a jar of pickles because, as she explained, Harold believed no sandwich qualified as supper without something pickled beside it. Mabel complained that there were only 3 plates. Clara told her there were 3 people. Mabel said that was not the point. Helen watched them with an expression Mabel could not read. They ate in the kitchen because the dining room table had been sold. For 23 years, Mabel had served supper to boarders in the dining room and eaten her own meal afterward in the kitchen. On the final night of the Reed boarding house, 3 women ate around the scarred kitchen table where mortgage money had been counted, debts recorded, letters written, school papers signed, and more arguments survived than Mabel could remember. Halfway through the meal, Helen asked Clara, "Did you hate my mother?" Clara considered it. "For about a week." Helen blinked. "That's all?" "I was busy." Mabel smiled into her coffee. Clara continued, "I hated what she did. I hated that Mama covered for her. I hated that the bank made us feel as if every late dollar were a character defect. Then somebody else needed something and the week ended. Helen looked down. My mother spent 6 years ashamed of it. People often keep punishments long after everyone else has gone home, Clara said. Mabel looked at her daughter. Clara shrugged. I've had time to learn a few things too. Helen touched the small metal tag beside her plate. I was angry with her before I came here. About what? Clara asked. About dying. Clara did not say that was unreasonable. Neither did Mabel. Helen continued. She knew she was getting worse. She wouldn't come live with me, wouldn't let me reduce my hours, wouldn't let me spend money on a private room when the hospital ward was enough. Every choice became an argument. That sounds like Maggie, Mabel said. I thought it was because she didn't trust me. Maybe it was partly. Helen looked up. Mabel did not soften the thought. The dead don't improve because we miss them. Helen nodded slowly. That's what she wrote. Yes. She also said not to turn her mistakes into instructions. Yes. Helen looked at the old luggage tag. For a moment she seemed much older than 22. Then she told them about Maggie's last weeks. She had been ill since spring, coughing first, then tiring so easily she had to sit while dressing. By June she could no longer sew a full day. By July, Helen had convinced her to enter the hospital. Maggie hated being a patient. She corrected the way blankets were folded. She complained that broth should not legally be called supper. She accused one nurse of walking like a funeral director. Helen imitated the expression her mother used when saying it, and Clara laughed. Mabel could see Maggie in every sentence. During those weeks, Helen had asked repeatedly about Des Moines. Maggie refused. Then one evening she asked Helen to bring the old valise from the closet. She placed the box inside it herself. Why didn't she just give it to you? Clara asked. Helen shook her head. She said some things needed to survive her before I opened them. Mabel closed her eyes. Maggie would say something like that. Dramatic enough to annoy you, true enough to stay. She died 2 days later, Helen said. No one spoke for a while. The kitchen clock ticked above the door. It was nearly 9. Mabel had expected her last night in the house to be spent checking cupboards and worrying over whether the buyer would complain about the cracked tile near the sink. Instead, Maggie Avery had returned in the only way the dead return reliably. Not as a ghost, but as unfinished work. Clara reached for another sandwich and noticed the brass door number beside Helen's valise. Mama gave you that? Yes. Clara looked at Mabel. You took them down? All of them. What did you do with the others? Box in the pantry. Clara smiled faintly. You should keep one. I am not hanging a boarding house number in my new flat. I didn't say hang it. What would I do with it? Remember. Mabel gave her a hard look. I have spent 6 weeks trying to remember less. Clara nodded. That too. Later, when Clara went upstairs to check the closets, Helen remained in the kitchen with Mabel. She seemed to have one more question. Mabel waited until Helen asked it. Do you need money? There it was. Mabel's back straightened. No. Helen looked around the nearly empty kitchen. You're losing the house. I am selling the house under circumstances I would not choose. That is not the same as begging. I didn't say you were begging. You were about to offer. I was going to ask what you need. I need fewer stairs. Helen almost smiled. Mabel. It was the first time she had used her first name. Mabel let it pass. I have some savings, Helen said. Not much, but some. And the money orders I sent over the years were spent. On what? Coal, roof patching, a furnace repair. Mrs. Patterson's boy's medicine once, probably. I did not keep your $3 in a glass case. Then let me replace it. No. Helen's face tightened. For one alarming moment, Mabel saw Maggie preparing to fight. Then Helen stopped. She breathed in and asked, Why? The difference between demanding and asking was small. Mabel noticed it anyway. Because if you give me money tonight, you'll spend the next 10 years wondering whether you paid for what happened in 1932. I don't think that. You will on a bad day. Helen looked down. And I might spend the next 10 years wondering whether I finally collected from your mother through you. Helen understood. So what do I do? Nothing. That seems unfair. Life remains stubbornly uninterested in balancing every account. Helen turned the luggage tag between her fingers. Then she said, "There is something I can do that isn't money." Mabel waited suspiciously. "The hospital in Cedar Rapids has 2 probationer nurses coming in January from smaller towns. Housing is always a problem." "I am not moving to Cedar Rapids to run another 8-room boarding house." "I didn't say 8 rooms." 4? "I didn't say you had to run anything." "Good." Helen smiled. "You are terrible at letting people finish." "I have heard that before." Helen explained. A widow near the hospital, Mrs. Weller, rented 2 upstairs rooms. She was getting older and wanted someone to share the work and keep an eye on the place when her married son was away. Helen had almost rented a room there herself before moving into nurses' quarters. Mrs. Weller did not need an employee exactly. She needed another woman who knew how to manage people. Mabel shook her head before Helen finished. "No." "Why?" "Because I am not leaving Des Moines." Helen nodded. "All right." Mabel was startled by the lack of argument. Helen put the tag back in the paper parcel. "Then don't." Mabel narrowed her eyes. "You sound disappointed. I thought you might like the idea." "I did not." "All right." Mabel became irrationally annoyed. "You could at least defend it." Helen laughed. Now Mabel saw exactly what Maggie had meant in the final letter. "Do not turn my mistakes into instructions." Helen had offered. Mabel had refused. And Helen, unlike her mother 6 years earlier, allowed the refusal to stand. Something moved inside Mabel that had nothing to do with Cedar Rapids. Respect, perhaps, or grief. They often arrived together. "I've already rented a flat," Mabel said. "Clara mentioned it. Above a bakery. That sounds nice. It smells like bread at 4 in the morning. That sounds nicer. It won't when you've smelled bread every morning for a year." Helen smiled. "My mother would have taken the room. Your mother would have complained about the rent, insulted the baker, reorganized his kitchen, and then stayed 12 years. Helen laughed again. This time Mabel joined her. Clara returned carrying a small cardboard box. "I found these in the hall closet." Inside were objects Mabel had forgotten to pack. A broken curtain ring, 2 old keys, a child's marble, a button from a railway uniform, a postcard from Nebraska, and a stack of letters tied with kitchen string. Mabel recognized the top envelope. Helen Avery, 1932. She had kept Helen's notes. She had forgotten that too. Clara sat down and began sorting. "Throw out the broken things," Mabel said. Clara held up the railway button. "Whose?" "No idea." "The marble?" "No idea." "The postcard?" Mabel squinted. "Mr. Keller, maybe." Helen looked at her. "You kept all this and don't know whose it is?" "Apparently." "That seems unlike you." "No, it is exactly like her," Clara said. She pulled a small notebook from the bottom of the box. Mabel recognized it immediately. The old room ledger. Not the financial ledger. That had gone to the accountant. This was the little book Mabel kept in the kitchen drawer during the worst years. Room number, name, date arrived, date left, sometimes a short note, forward mail to sister, works nights, no onions, owes for Thursday, mother ill in Ottumwa, has good shoes for interview, needs train at 6. Mabel had not seen the book in years. Clara opened it. The handwriting changed over time, firm at first, rushed later. Some pages carried grease marks or coffee stains. Room 7 appeared again and again. Margaret Avery, February 11th, 1932. Below the name in Mabel's handwriting was a note. Girl Helen, 16, fever, school papers in desk. A second note had been squeezed beneath it later. Helen to Cedar Rapids, February 29th, keep room. Helen touched the words. "You wrote keep room." "I suppose I did." "You don't remember?" "No." Helen looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "I do." Mabel waited. "The day I left, I thought Mother was abandoning me. I thought Aunt Ruth would keep me until she got tired of me. Then I'd go somewhere else." I had spent weeks listening to adults talk about money as if every meal I ate were a problem that needed solving. Mabel swallowed. Helen continued. "You gave me that tag and told me the room was mine even when I wasn't in it. I don't remember the exact words. Mother did, apparently. But I remember what it felt like." Mabel looked at the little ledger. I was trying to stop you from making a scene at the bus station. I know. I may have been annoyed. You were definitely annoyed. I wasn't making a grand promise. I know. Then why? Because it didn't have to be grand to matter. Mabel stopped. Helen's eyes were wet again, but her voice was steady. When I was in training and wanted to quit, Mother reminded me about room 7. When I failed my first practical examination, she reminded me. When I thought I was too poor to belong among girls whose families sent them money, she told me that a woman in Des Moines had put my name beside a room before she knew whether I'd ever pay for it. Mabel looked down. Helen continued. I don't know if you saved my life. That would be too large a thing to say. But you changed its direction. Mabel felt something in her chest tighten. The sentence frightened her more than gratitude would have. Gratitude could be refused. A direction could not. Helen reached across the table and touched the ledger. I became a nurse because a teacher noticed me, because my aunt kept me, because my mother fought for me and sometimes fought too hard, because I was stubborn, because people helped. You're one of those people. Mabel stared at the page. For years, Clara's complaint had followed her. Every room became somebody else's emergency. Mabel had carried the sentence as proof that she had failed her daughter in some way. Perhaps she had. There were no clean acquittals in families. But now another sentence sat beside it. You changed its direction. The two truths did not cancel each other. That was what surprised her. She could have kept Clara housed and still made Clara lonely. She could have crowded the house with strangers and still given some of those strangers the first safe night they had experienced in months. She could have resented Maggie's theft and still be glad she had not called the police before morning. A life did not become good or bad because one account finally balanced. The clock reached 10. Helen had missed the last convenient bus east. Mabel realized it before Helen mentioned it. You'll stay here tonight. Helen looked toward the staircase. There isn't a bed. Clara has blankets in the car. Clara frowned. I do? You always have blankets in the car. I have one. See? Helen smiled. Where am I supposed to sleep? Mabel stood. Room 7. Clara laughed. Mama, you sold the bed. There is a rug. You're putting a guest on a rug? She's young. I work 12-hour shifts, Helen said. I've slept in worse places. Mabel pointed at her. See? A professional opinion. They made a bed from quilts on the floor. Clara brought the blanket from the car. Mabel found an old pillow in a packing box. Helen placed the brass 7 on the windowsill and the small luggage tag beside it. For the first time in 6 years, both numbers were in the same room. Before going downstairs, Mabel paused in the doorway. Helen was sitting on the quilts with Earl's letter in her lap. You all right? No. Mabel nodded. Good answer. Helen looked up. I think I'll be all right later. Also a good answer. Mabel left the door open. She did not sleep much. Neither did Helen. Around 1 in the morning, Mabel heard footsteps overhead. Around 2, the floorboards became quiet. At 3, rain stopped. At 4, a bakery truck passed in the street, making Mabel think of the apartment waiting for her above another bakery and the ridiculousness of complaining about bread. At 6, she rose and made the last breakfast ever cooked in the Reed boarding house. Eggs, toast, coffee. The jar of peaches he had been saving for no occasion. She opened it. That seemed occasion enough. Helen came downstairs with swollen eyes and Maggie's letter folded carefully in her pocket. Clara arrived before 7, bringing more boxes and Harold. Harold Bennett was a quiet man who had survived 20 years of marriage to Clara partly by knowing when a room contained a conversation that did not need him. He greeted Helen, carried boxes, and asked no questions. At 8:30, the man from the bank arrived with the buyer. Mabel had dreaded that moment for weeks. It turned out to be ordinary. Papers were checked, keys counted. The buyer inspected the back door and asked about the furnace. Mabel told him exactly which pipe knocked in January and which window swelled shut in July. He seemed surprised by her honesty. Mabel was surprised anyone would prefer to discover those things later. Then came the final key, the front door. Mabel held it in her palm. For 23 years she had carried that key in an apron pocket. Sometimes she had slept with it on the bedside table. Sometimes boarders had woken her after midnight, and she had gone downstairs muttering that grown people should learn to manage keys. Now a man in a clean overcoat held out his hand. Mabel placed the key in it. Nothing happened. The ceiling did not fall. Frank did not vanish a second time. Clara did not become 15 again. The house did not accuse her of leaving. It was only a key changing hands. Mabel stepped onto the porch. Helen stood beside her, carrying the old valise. Clara and Harold waited near the car. The morning was cold and bright after the rain. Mabel turned back once. 8 upstairs windows, a porch railing Frank had repaired in 1917, a chimney rebuilt in 1926, a door that had opened to more people than Mabel could count. She expected grief. It came, but it was not empty grief. It was crowded. Joseph Keller laughing over meatloaf. Mrs. Doherty talking through breakfast. Children sleeping under borrowed blankets. Railroad men leaving before dawn. Teachers practicing lessons aloud. Women arriving with suitcases and leaving with jobs. Maggie Avery standing in the kitchen with stolen money and enough courage to return. Helen at 16, furious beside a bus with a metal tag wired to her valise. Mabel had spent months thinking the house was being taken away from her. Standing on the sidewalk, she understood something different. A house could be lost without everything that happened inside it being lost too. Helen reached into her coat pocket. She held out the brass number 7. "You should keep this one." Mabel shook her head. "I gave it to you. You gave me the traveling one first." Helen showed the smaller tag. "This is enough." Mabel looked at the brass number, then at the house. Finally, she accepted it. "All right." She put it in her apron pocket, the same pocket that had held room keys, grocery lists, rent coins, buttons, headache powders, school notes, and once a frog brought indoors by Mrs. Patterson's boy. The number fit among the ordinary things. That seemed right. Helen returned to Cedar Rapids that afternoon. Before she left, she and Mabel stood at the bus station where Helen had departed 6 years earlier. The station looked smaller than either remembered. Helen held Maggie's box beneath one arm. "What will you do with my father's letter?" Mabel asked. "I don't know yet." "Good," Helen smiled. "You approve of not knowing?" "I approve of not making every decision before supper." "My mother would be shocked." "Your mother would argue for half an hour and then claim it was her idea." Helen laughed. When the bus was called, she did not hug Mabel immediately. Neither woman seemed built for immediate hugs. Then Helen stepped forward and put both arms around her. Mabel stood stiffly for 1 second. Then she hugged her back. "Thank you," Helen said. Mabel almost answered that there was nothing to thank her for. The words rose automatically. She stopped them. Perhaps gratitude was another thing a person should not always decide for someone else. "You're welcome," she said. Helen boarded the bus. This time no one had sent her away. This time she chose the road herself. Mabel watched until the bus was gone. Then Clara drove her to the new flat. The rooms above the bakery were smaller than Mabel remembered from the viewing. 2 windows. 1 bedroom. A sitting room with a narrow stove. A kitchen alcove hardly large enough for 2 women to dislike each other uncomfortably. Mabel stood in the center while Clara unpacked dishes. At 4 the next morning, the smell of bread woke her. She lay in the unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling. For 23 years, waking before dawn had meant breakfast for 6, 8, sometimes 12 people. Now there was nobody waiting. The silence frightened her. She got up, made coffee, sat beside the window. Across the street, a streetcar passed almost empty. A man in a white apron carried trays inside the bakery below. Mabel reached into the pocket of the dress hanging over a chair. The brass 7 was still there. She set it on the windowsill. For a week she did almost nothing. This proved harder than work. She visited Clara and criticized the way Harold stored potatoes. She walked to the library and left after 20 minutes because everyone whispered. She bought a newspaper and read even the advertisements. She tried sleeping until 7 and woke at 5:30 feeling guilty. On the 8th day, someone knocked at her door. Mabel opened it. A young woman stood in the hall wearing a brown coat and holding a suitcase. For one impossible second, Mabel thought of Maggie. Then the woman smiled nervously. "Are you Mrs. Reed?" "Yes. Mrs. Bennett said you might know where a girl could find a room around here. I start at the telephone exchange Monday." Mabel closed her eyes. Clara, of course. "I don't rent rooms." "Oh," the girl's face fell. Mabel looked past her at the suitcase. One handle had been repaired with cord. "Where are you staying tonight?" "I haven't found anywhere yet." Mabel sighed. The flat had 1 bedroom, 1 sitting room, 1 narrow couch, She had no business taking in anybody. Absolutely none. "What's your name?" "Rose Miller." "Can you pay anything?" $3 a week after Monday. I have $1 now." Mabel stared at her. Then she stepped aside. "One night." Rose entered. "One night," Mabel repeated. Rose stayed 11 days. Not because Mabel changed her mind about running a boarding house, because the room Clara found for Rose would not be ready until December. Mabel charged her $2 for the first week and $3 for the second. She made Rose buy her own breakfast cereal. She refused to wash Rose's stockings. She insisted repeatedly that this was not a boarding house. Rose agreed every time. On the 10th day, she brought home another telephone operator whose landlady had suddenly taken ill. Mabel sent the second girl away with 3 addresses and strict instructions about which landlord overcharged for heat. Some habits did not require a house. By Christmas, Mabel knew the names of 6 landladies within a mile, 2 churchwomen who occasionally had rooms, a widow near the streetcar line, and a family willing to rent an attic to a married couple without children. People began appearing at the bakery asking for Mrs. Reed. The baker found this amusing. Mabel did not. At least she claimed not to. Clara stopped apologizing. In January, Mabel received a letter from Helen. The envelope contained no money. That pleased her. Helen wrote that she had returned to work. She had kept Earl's letter. She had not decided whether she forgave Maggie for hiding it. She suspected forgiveness was not a single decision anyway. Mabel approved of that sentence. Helen also wrote that she had visited Earl's grave. She did not feel what she expected. No great release, no sudden understanding. She stood in the cold for 10 minutes, told him aloud that she had finished her training, and left. On the next page, she described a young patient who had come into the hospital frightened and alone. Helen had stayed after her shift because the girl kept insisting she did not need anyone. "I knew that sentence," Helen wrote. "It belonged to my mother." Then she added, "So I did not argue with her. I just sat there until she stopped needing to say it." Mabel read that line twice. At the bottom of the page, Helen had drawn a small number 7. No explanation. None was needed. The years that followed did not transform Mabel into a wealthy woman or a saint. She remained difficult about money. She still believed most soup was improved by salt and most apologies by brevity. She still argued with Clara. Clara still accused her of collecting strays. Mabel still denied it. But the loss of the Reed boarding house stopped feeling like the end of her useful life. In 1939, the baker's sister moved away and left a 3-room apartment vacant on the floor above Mabel. Mabel rented it with Rose Miller, who by then was earning steady wages at the telephone exchange. Rose took 1 bedroom. Mabel kept her own flat below. The extra room upstairs went to a schoolteacher whose pay was modest and whose mother lived 2 counties away. Mabel charged a fair rent, not the lowest in the neighborhood. Clara made her promise. When someone could not pay, Mabel wrote the amount down instead of pretending it did not exist. Sometimes the debt was repaid. Sometimes it was not. She learned slowly that compassion did not require bad bookkeeping. Clara learned slowly that a crowded house had not meant her mother loved strangers more than her daughter. One Sunday they finally spoke about 1915 without arguing. Mabel admitted she had turned the family home into a business so quickly after Frank's death because stopping long enough to grieve felt dangerous. Clara admitted that as a girl she had mistaken necessity for preference. Neither apologized for everything, they apologized for enough. Helen visited the following spring. She brought no money. She brought a loaf of rye bread from Cedar Rapids and a photograph of herself in her nurse's uniform. Mabel placed it on the small shelf above her stove. Beside it, she put the brass 7. "That is sentimental," Clara said. "It's practical, keeps the photograph from sliding." Of course. In 1940, Helen became a night supervisor on one of the hospital wards. She wrote less often because she worked more. Mabel did not mistake silence for forgetting. That was another thing she had learned. In the summer of 1941, Helen returned once more. She was 25 then, older in the face, steadier in the way she carried herself. She arrived with a small girl of about 17 walking beside her. The girl was not Helen's daughter. She was the younger sister of a patient who had died that spring. Their father was ill. Their aunt in Des Moines had agreed to take her while she trained for office work, but the arrangement had fallen through at the last moment. Helen did not ask Mabel to take her in. That mattered. She asked whether Mabel knew someone with a room. Mabel did. 3 someones, in fact. She made telephone calls from the bakery downstairs. By supper, the girl had a clean attic room with a widow named Mrs. Hayes, 2 blocks from a streetcar stop. The rent was $4 a week with breakfast. Mabel inspected the mattress herself. Helen watched from the doorway. On the walk back, she said, "You know you still run a boarding house." "I do not." "You just spread it across half the neighborhood." Mabel considered this. "That is different." "How?" "I don't scrub the floors." Helen laughed. They stopped outside the bakery. Summer evening light lay across the sidewalk. People were talking on stoops. A radio played through an open window. Somewhere nearby, a child was bouncing a ball against brick. The country was changing again. News from Europe had become harder to ignore. Factories were busier. Young men discussed what might come next. Nobody knew exactly what the following year would ask of them. Mabel was 66. She had learned not to pretend uncertainty could be defeated by worrying earlier. Helen reached into her handbag. She still carried the small metal luggage tag. The cream paint was almost entirely gone now. The black 7 remained. "You still have that?" Mabel asked. "Yes." "What for?" Helen smiled. "Same reason you keep yours." "Mine holds up a photograph." "Of course." They went upstairs. That night, after Helen had gone to Clara's house for supper, Mabel sat alone beside the window. The brass number rested on the shelf. For years, she had thought the useful part of her life could be counted in rooms filled, meals served, rent collected, sheets washed, keys handed out. Then she thought losing the house meant losing the evidence that any of it had mattered. She understood better now. Most of what mattered had left the building long before she did. It walked around in people. In Rose Miller, answering telephone calls with a steady wage and a room she could afford. In Clara, opening her home without resenting every stranger who entered it. In Joseph Keller, who sent a Christmas card from Nebraska each year and still owed Mabel 75 cents he pretended not to remember. In Helen Avery, who had once been a frightened 16-year-old with one red mitten and was now the woman other frightened people met in the middle of the night. Mabel could not claim those lives. She had not made them. She had only stood at a few doors when they arrived. Sometimes she had opened the door. Sometimes she had made coffee. Sometimes she had lied to a man on the porch. Sometimes she had been angry and helped anyway. Sometimes she had done the right thing for the wrong reason. Sometimes she had done the wrong thing and had to live long enough to see it clearly. Nothing about that was grand. That was why she trusted it. She picked up the brass 7 and turned it over in her palm. The back was scratched from years on a wooden door. No inscription, no message, just metal. Mabel smiled. The smaller tag had traveled with Helen. The larger number had stayed on the house. One had meant that a person could leave and still belong somewhere. The other had taught Mabel the opposite lesson. A place could leave you and still belong to your life. Downstairs, the baker began preparing dough for morning. Soon the whole building would smell like bread. Mabel no longer complained about it. She set the number back beside Helen's photograph and turned off the lamp. For a few seconds, the room was dark. Then light from the streetcar slid across the wall and passed on. Mabel stood at the window until it was gone. Tomorrow someone would knock. Someone always did. And if they needed a room, Mabel would tell them very firmly that she did not run a boarding house anymore. Then she would probably ask their name.